Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this beautiful first Saturday of the Charleston Festival. And I'm thrilled to welcome our speakers, Ronald Blythe, Robert Macfarlane at the far end, and Olivia Laing, who will chair this afternoon's session. Ronald Blythe is the pioneer chronicler of rural life. His groundbreaking book, Akenfield, Portrait of an English Village, is now a Penguin modern classic. He's also written novels, short stories, poetry, literary criticism, and social history, and has been president of the John Clare Society for 30 years. In 2006, he was awarded the Benson Medal, the highest honour of the Royal Society of Literature. His recent book, At the Yeoman's House, focuses on his home, Bottengoms Farm, which he inherited from the painter John Nash, and which he'll be talking about during this afternoon. Robert Macfarlane won the Guardian First Book Award, the Somerset Maugham Award, and the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award for his first book, Mountains of the Mind. His second, The Wild Places, was similarly celebrated, winning 3 prizes and being shortlisted for 6 more. Both books were adapted for television by the BBC. His new book, which we'll be discussing today, is The Old Ways, A Journey on Foot. His writing has frequently been described as being in the tradition of W.J. Sebald. Olivia Laing, our chair, is a writer and critic and was previously the deputy literary editor of The Observer. Her book, To the River, A Journey Beneath the Surface, is a lyrical reflection on nature and solitude, with Virginia Woolf as its presiding spirit that twists and turns with the River Ouse. It was described as sublime by the Times and magical by the Telegraph, and was a book of the year in the Independent, the Financial Times, and the Evening Standard. It's currently shortlisted for the Ondaatje Prize, awarded for A Sense of Place, which will be announced later this week. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Olivia, who will guide us through the rest of this session. Olivia Laing.
Absolutely delighted to be introducing Ronald Blythe and Robert Macfarlane today. Their new books, At the Yeoman's House and The Old Ways, are, without exaggeration, 2 of the most beautiful things I've read this year. And they work beautifully together too. Both are intensely attentive to the natural world, to a sense of place, and to how landscape affects the people who live within it and who pass through it. The writer, novelist, critic and poet Ronald Blythe has lived in Suffolk all his life. He has rarely left East Anglia, though his attention and interests have been wide-ranging. He's perhaps best known for Akenfield, an oral history of sorts, the record of the lives of a Suffolk village at a time when the ancient, established patterns of farming were changing forever. It's an extraordinary, mesmerising work that continues to inspire readers and writers today. Ronald has written and edited many other books, including novels, the most recent of which is The Assassin. It would be difficult to find in England now a sensibility which is richer or better fed, more deeply watered and manured, more drenched in Englishness, Adam Nicholson has said of him, while John Updike observed, "His words have the weight of things firmly fixed in his mind's eye." Though his work is rooted in the flat fields of his home county, it's never precisely parochial, and certainly not limited in scope. The hallmark of Blythe's writing is its ability to collapse time, to see the common thread between centuries, indeed millennia, of history. His new book, At the Yeoman's House, could be described as the story of his relationship with Bottengoms, the Suffolk farmhouse he inherited from his friend, the painter John Nash. But it's a stranger, more wide-ranging affair than that. It moves dreamlike through the emptied fields, encountering Elizabeth I, out hunting in Suffolk in 1561, Neolithic graves, the funeral of a friend, the poems of John Clare, the war art of Paul Nash, and above all, the ghosts of farmers that haunt any rural acre of England, even in our own post-industrial century. It's moving, exquisitely written and deeply thought-provoking, an astonishing book by one of our greatest and most subtle writers. Exquisite, subtle, and thought-provoking are also epithets that could be applied to Robert Macfarlane's The Old Ways, the third book in what he calls a loose trilogy about landscape and the human heart. The other two books in that trilogy are, of course, Mountains of the Mind and The Wild Places. Robert has been described by the New York Review of Books as a naturalist who can unfurl a sentence with the breathless ease of a master angler, and by Jan Morris as a sublimely civilised writer. His new book, The Old Ways, this roving, wandering book is, well, it's many things. It's a biography, a biogeography, in fact, of the poet Edward Thomas and the artist Eric Ravilius. It's an account of walks through Palestine, the Himalayas, the Cairngorms and our own Sussex. And it is, above all, an investigation into why landscapes matter to us. In a minute, we'll be exploring some of the issues of both books and some of the lovely points of convergence between them. But first, Ronald and Robert are going to read from their books. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Ronald Blythe.
I'm actually going to talk about my book, not read from it really. I think most of us have had the experience of certain places, certain houses, certain gardens, which belong to our own personal memory, but we haven't visited them, such as Henry James's house in Rye, or Shakespeare's birthplace, or perhaps Keats' house, etc., or perhaps the house or place where some modern writer has been. And all my life, really from my 20s onwards, I've heard about Charleston, because my friend John Nash and his wife Christine Kulanthal, the artist, were closely associated just before the First World War with these artists. And John was, I was going to say, notoriously in love with Carrington, as many boys and some girls were. And he talked about a great deal. And when he died, I found this big tin trunk, which is full of her letters. They illustrated their letters, these young people, with lovely drawings, wherever they'd been. And I suddenly saw this relationship and wrote a book about it at the time. But I don't know why I've not been here. It's amazing. And it's more wonderful. The rooms in the house more wonderful than I could possibly have imagined. The lovely faded quality of them, the timelessness of them. And also the great sense of people painting and writing in them. This, I remember being in the West Country once and seeing houses like this where people had actually worked in the rooms or in the gardens. So I was brought up on the edges of Suffolk and Essex with the Stour running between us, and also between the territories of Gainsborough at Sudbury and Constable at Dedham. And the Constable family are the descendants of the painter, are great friends of mine. I see them frequently. And I have this enormous sense of art all around me. And it was the time when Sir Cedric Morris had come back from France to establish the School of Painting and Drawing in Suffolk with his friend Let Haynes. And in my early 20s, I used to go there, and his first pupil was Lucian Freud, in just before the war. And all around me there were these people who belonged to another generation, who possessed the possessions of another generation, who sometimes talked rather like John Nash of another generation, and lots of times of this place. And we used to read in the evenings. I used to read to them till they fell asleep, L.P. Hartley or Henry James or all kinds of people like that. And they were also what they call plantsmen. They never called themselves gardeners. They called themselves plantsmen. Cedric Morris said he was an artist plantsman. John Nash said he was an artist plantsman. And their gardens, rather like the garden here, full of unusual plants with wildflowers and garden flowers all mixed up together. and they're enchanting. Well, Paul Nash only came to the house once. He suffered from asthma, made worse by gassing in the First World War. And my new book, At the Yeoman's House, describes his one night in this house, in what is now the guest room. He died a few months later. And he'd always had this dream, really, of flying, but he could never fly because of the asthma. But he painted the Battle of Britain, and his war pictures are unique, because nobody else did this in the same way. Totis Mirror, this wonderful thing, all the fallen hindquarters and Messerschmitts in a tinny-looking heap. And also the wonderful sort of things in the sky, the streams of gas and vapor trails, which are kind of poems. And the War Ministry at the time thought they were just good propaganda, and not understanding how wonderful they were. But when I found the descriptions which John had made of his brother coming to the house for this one night before he died, in the room which I often use, and which is extremely like one of the rooms here, with the same kind of art in it, except it's a Tudor room and not an 18th century room, I think of how houses hold together not only the work of the farms, but also that of poets and painters. When I was young, it's quite normal for artists and painters in East Anglia just to find an old house. They never bought it on the whole. John did buy my house, but mostly they just rented it. And they made gardens round it, and they painted in it, and they knew each other. And they were rather cut off from ordinary life, and they were really rather broke. They had bikes and things like that. And they were very celebrated in their own way. And John used to go off painting twice a year with Edward Borden or Carol Waite or another friend, and their two wives, poor wives who had to sort of put up with this behaviour, really, of staying in little pubs in Cornwall or Scotland, etc., while the boys, as they were called, they were quite old, painted and brought the sketchbooks home to paint in the autumn. And the discipline of these lives infected me, who is a very kind of strict, disciplined sort of writer who writes every morning, gets up early, and gardens every afternoon, and sees friends, and has a lot of things which have been left to him by people who died. And somehow I live half in the present and half in the past. And of course, my family had been in Suffolk for many generations, and they farmed little farms. They were shepherds. They knew all about agriculture. And it was quite a normal thing for me to see these things. The other thing is I can't drive, so I've walked everywhere or cycled everywhere. And I also loved architecture, so I've studied buildings. And then when I first became a writer, I worked for Britain, who were going to be 100 next year, so we're all writing books about him. And my 2 years at Aldeburgh, where I can only mostly remember being cold, but I did an enormous amount of work for them, edited the programs and things like that. And so if you've done this in your life as a working writer or artist or two mixed together, it is your normal atmosphere. You go on doing it all the time until you die. And they give you things, and you give them things, and you love music. And you've seen sometimes humble things become famous things or celebrated things. And you saw how it was done. And I suppose in a way you imitated them. Their emphasis on me was colossal, which I didn't realize at the time, or that I'd worked quite so hard. My passion is literature, and I read all the diaries kept by Virginia and all the books about the Bloomsbury period, and I went to Monk's house once just after Leonard had died, and looked through the windows. And somehow, because of the Nashes talking so much about Carrington and Duncan Grant, and then eventually, just before I left Britain, Duncan and Vanessa came to Aldeburgh because Duncan had done the decor for Lennox Berkeley's one-act opera, A Dinner Engagement, and Vanessa had done the decor for one-act opera by John Blow, the Elizabethan artist. And so we were all squashed in a pub, and I had this one glimpse of, I thought, rather tall people drinking bitter, and just watching and thinking, as a very young person, how amazing these people were, that they actually existed. They weren't sort of fantasies. So when I came today for the first time to see this lovely place on a day like this after all the rain, and saw the gardens, which are not unlike mine, although mine's much untidier, it's a kind of joy to be here, to see you all, to come to this place. So thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm quite given to plosives, so I don't want to pop too much. But can you all hear me? I'm not popping too much. Okay. Thank you very, very much, particularly to those who've invited me here to this great breathing tent. There's a line in Ronald's book where he talks about how Bottengoms doesn't really have an inside or an outside. It's aerated, it transmits, and this is the perfect place to talk about that phenomenon and others besides, especially that of, I guess, time travel and the way that certain landmarks, especially those that are made by repeated action, the dip in the bricks that Ronald talks about at his own house and the wear on the sill that we see here, how these marks can hold and archive time in ways that are surprising and haunting, and difficult to unpick, but unmistakable to experience. And I suppose that is part of the subject of my own book, Old Ways. And this book, it began not with an idea really, but a place. And that place was a holloway in South Dorset, near Chiddock, that I travelled to, I think, though I lose count slightly now. Am I allowed to say that at the age of 35? I think it was 7 years ago, and I travelled there with a man called Roger Deacon, who many of you will know, who's a dear friend of Ronald's, and we both wrote about it afterwards. But it was a very strange few days that we spent in this old, sunken route that leads from the sea northwards up through the sandstone of Dorset that's been worn deep down into a hollow way, deep down into the surface rock there by wheelfall, rainfall, footfall. And we spent days there and began to discover that time looped back on itself, it repeated itself, or slightly more complicatedly, it pleated itself in this place. So we discovered a history of Catholic recusancy. We discovered that priests in the 16th and 17th century had been coming back across the Channel and trying to hold what the Protestant saw as feral masses in the woods, but obviously the Catholics saw as true services underway, but they were being held in barns, they were being held in hedgerows. We discovered that the Chiddock martyrs had been pursued, had gone feral, as it were, and fugitive in this landscape. And we also had been led there in the first place by a book called Rogue Male by Geoffrey Household, which is a fictional account of a 20th century big game hunter who decides to hunt the biggest game of them all in around 1939, which was Hitler, and who goes to Germany to try and take Hitler out and is then pursued back to this landscape by Nazi henchmen, and eventually himself goes fugitive and takes cover in this holloway. And we began to see that a territorial imperative of a kind was at work, that people were behaving and thinking in strangely similar ways across centuries. And it was out of that place and its strange behaviours that this book, I suppose, emerged. And it's taken 5 years, and it's particularly another kind of loop for me, is that early in the writing of it, I went to Bottengoms to see Ronnie, and I drove down the deep path that leads to his farm, that is itself a kind of holloway that has been worn into the ground over centuries. And I had a wonderful afternoon, and I saw the poison plant garden of John Nash, and I talked with Ronnie about paths and their long usage, about Suffolk customs of hanging sickles at one end of a footpath so that a walker would come along and pick up the sickle and nick off the tendril that extended across the path, and then leave the sickle hanging at the far end of the path so a walker coming in the other direction could do the same. And in this way a consensual open path was maintained. This idea of a path as a commons, as something that is worked upon and kept open by groups of people. It's very hard to make a path on your own. Richard Long tried it, but he only made a an end-stopped path, which is no path at all, really, because paths connect and they relate and they join places to places and they join people to people. And I left on that wonderful day. Ronnie weighed me down with gifts. I left with a beautiful woodcut print of a guinea fowl. Very odd to see a slightly exotic bird in that very, very, as it were, British rural Buickian style, which is still on my wall in my room at Cambridge. I also left with a number of books, one of which I have just handed back to Ronald. The library fine, as I said, was pretty large by the time I gave it back, but I gave it back with a book to follow it. And so for me to come back now and to read Ronald's book, which itself has many path crossings with my own, and he also gave me that day a poem about his own track, about walking his own track. And that poem, I discovered, turns up at the Yeoman's house. And this really is in keeping with what I've experienced as I've walked, which is that paths cross and they crisscross, and footprint trails overlap with one another. And you find that you are walking, if not in the footprints of other people, at least you are converging with them. And probably the most extraordinary walk I have ever taken occurs at the very end of the book, and it happened up on the Formby coast near Liverpool. And there, as some of you may know, on the intertidal silts, in the Mesolithic period, it was a very fertile, fecund, habitable place. It was rich in shellfish for foraging. There was a bountiful fen car which provided for a pretty substantial Mesolithic population. It was also home to aurochs. It was also home to cranes. It was also home to red deer whose hooves were 12 inches long. And these people, these inhabitants, this community, left its prints in the silts. And on hot days, they would press their prints into the silts as they were walking. The sun would then bake the silts. The next tide, if it were gentle, would come in, and sand would settle like a kind of packing material into those prints. Then the next tide would leave sand on top of that, which would get baked. And in that way, these footprints were laid down like a series of pages. And what is now happening is that process is being reversed and has been for several decades. Coastal erosion means that those pages are being lifted up and lifted off. And so sometimes these print trails emerge briefly in the intertidal zone. They don't last very long. They're not museum artifacts because the intertidal zone is a kind of unbiddable space. You can't control it. As we well know, you can't hold the tide back no matter how hard you try. So the day I went up there, I found a footprint trail that ran some 30 yards, and it was a man and a woman walking 5,000 summers ago. They were walking side by side at about 4 miles an hour. We know that the man was around 6'2" tall. We know that the woman was around 5'7" tall. There are specialists who can tell this from your footprint. So, robbers out there, be careful. Don't step in the flower beds. She had a raised arch. He had a long toenail. They were probably just walking. They weren't foraging. They were just walking shore parallel. And then a little further up, we came across a gaggle of smaller footprints. And these were children, possibly their children, who were mudlarking on a hot summer's day, not unlike this one, 5,000 summers ago. And indeed, there were children there at the time, real, as it were, living children, who were just hopscotching and jumping around on these footprints because they weren't museum artifacts. Nobody is there to say, stop, don't destroy the 5,000-year-old print trail. They didn't know what they were hopping over. And I experienced then what I experienced many times, which was not time travel exactly. It took me some time to work out that wasn't what was so interesting about the experience. It wasn't that I was moving back in time. It's that time was becoming, or time's levels were becoming coeval, that there was a sharing of time going on, and that my own walking side by side with these footprints was a kind of simultaneity with much earlier walkers. And that told me something about walking as well, which is that it has a kinship of motion. It's what we've been doing as a species for as long as we have been a species. And almost as long as we have been walking, we have been leaving paths. Our paths are our earliest artifacts. Our footprints are our earliest letters. Our print trails are our earliest sentences. And there is an uncanniness that comes from trying to read these at once wholly familiar and also utterly inscrutable marks left perhaps by a stranger a week ago or a stranger 5,000 years ago. So this book represents then a 4 or 5 year attempt to walk up the stories of old ways, of old paths, of those who have walked them and loved them and lived through them. It's an attempt to think about how we think with landscape as well as about it, the metaphors we use to describe ourselves to ourselves, our journeys through life, the paths we take. And I became particularly interested in people for whom that idea was particularly powerful. Edward Thomas, the poet, some of you will be coming to Matthew Hollis's wonderful event this evening about how Thomas perceived himself so powerfully in terms of chalk landscapes, in terms of forests and trees and paths and corners and paths that went over the hill and out of sight or petered out. Or Eric Ravilius, another chalk lover, and another aerial dreamer, in fact, who very often imagined seeing the world from above and indeed died while doing so as a war artist in 1942, taking a flight off the Icelandic coast near Caldadarnes. And the strange draws and fascinations, but also the subtle and generous and widespread ways in which all of us make sense of ourselves using our places. Robert Frost writes in The Road Less Travelled, he says, the poem that very famously begins, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood," probably the most famous path-following poem of them all. And at one point he says, "Knowing how way leads on to way." Well, I know that now too, because I began on the chalk and I ended up on granite and dolerite and Middle Eastern limestone and Himalayan strange compound schists, and I ended up eventually coming back to the chalk and walking and following. And those kinds of time travel, those kinds of path crossing have in their way found another version of themselves today when I find myself here with Ronnie. I'll just end by saying that I went back to the Holloway that I went to with Roger last autumn, eventually, with an artist called Stanley Donwood, who's most famous as, I guess, he's famous for many things, but he's probably most famous as the so-called sixth member of Radiohead, so he's done all Radiohead cover art. But he's an extraordinary artist, including that, but above and beyond it as well. And he too had become fascinated by this Holloway and this space, and we went back. And I wasn't expecting to, but I did catch strange memory glimpses of 6 years earlier, of Roger sort of there. I found the marks that we had left when we'd whittled holly sticks using blunt penknives at the end of a day. I saw Roger, but I also failed to see him as well, and I realised a little of how landscapes resist our attempts to resuscitate them, how the ghosts that walk in them are not always available to us and not always fully there. You can't turn up in a place and expect you will know more about it and its predecessors in some perfect or ideal version. But I was taken aback by these jolts to the heart that this landscape gave me. And I even sort of saw my earlier self. I realised I'd become my own ghost. I don't write about that in the book, but it was, in its way, the end of those 4 or 5 years of walking. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, both of you. That was absolutely beautiful. One of the things that I found very interesting about both these books is it seems to me they're puzzling away about the same sort of questions about time, the landscape itself, how they fit together, but that you're coming at it almost from opposite angles, in that, Ronald, you stay very much in your home stretch. You're beating the bounds, let's say, of a home landscape, whereas all your books, certainly The Old Ways and the Wild Places, start literally with you walking away from your house. And I wondered if you could both talk about the merits of those ways of working.
I think probably mine is laziness.
I didn't mean to expose that.
The house is very isolated. It had 70 acres. I've got 2. The river is about a mile away, and I've seen it all my life, etc. And it creates a kind of dream, really, on top of which there's a lot of what I suppose you might call study of people, somebody who reads a lot and knows a lot about plants and listens to music, and also has very nice friends coming to see him. So these things alter it to a degree. Basically, it's a kind of solitude. But what what Robert was saying about the First World War poet, Edward Thomas. And his tragedy of being killed almost the last shot of the First World War was awful. But there was another poet called Gurney who got so-called shell shock and was locked up in a bin, and Mrs. Thomas and a friend of hers went to see him. He's a tall man in this terrible place. He was dressed in a dressing gown with his so-called shell shock. And first of all, they could do nothing. In his room, it was like a prison cell. He'd been at the Western Front. He'd just got an iron bed and a chair, nothing else whatsoever in this rather dreary room. But there was a piano. And Gurney was one of the major composers of that period. We talked about it with César Franck and people like that at that time. But so now and again he would play this piano, but not his proper music, but something which pleased these other poor inmates from the Western Front. And when they came away, Mrs. Thomas, Helen, thought they couldn't leave him like this. So when she got home, she found her husband's maps of Gloucestershire. And when they went back again, she spread them on his bed. And as she moved her finger through the footpaths, over the footpaths and the places where Gurney had been, he totally changed. He became kind of what we call better, different, etc. And this is her way into his terrible illness and dreadful things which had happened to him. He was left, I'm sorry to say, in this state until he died, practically. But on the bed in this then called lunatic asylum, this map was spread out of Gloucestershire, and she put his finger on the footpaths which he'd walked and knew backwards, and suddenly all the darkness went. And I think, too, myself, that John Clare, the poet, behaved like this. His difficulty was to find somewhere where he could write without people staring at him, because it's very unheard of for a farm worker, peasant they were called in those days, to be writing all the time. And so he would be hiding in different places and lying low, etc. It's quite hard, or was hard in those days when everybody was out of doors doing work. Now nobody's out of doors. You can walk for miles around my house and not meet a soul. Perhaps just a woman riding or something like that, who come from a town. So it's all changed. And it's a good thing that people like Robert is walking again properly and teaching us how to walk and how to look.
Well, thank you. And I suppose to answer the question, I love my home. I love my family, but I am fascinated by people. I don't know my home landscape. I live in a suburb. I know it as well as one can know a suburb, and I have walked it. I feel affection for it, but I haven't mapped it in a deep and heartfelt way. But I'm fascinated by people who have. I'm fascinated by localists, parochialists who are, as it were, visionary, because I see the parish, however we take that unit of territory, as a focusing device, as a lens that allows you to see broadly, an aperture to which you put your eye and glance through to see the wider world. And so increasingly I've been walking with people, and with people who know their paths and know their places profoundly, but who are not limited. I spent a lot of time up in the Outer Hebrides on sailing the sea roads, which are paths of long usage themselves. And I was there with a man called Ian Stephen, a lyric poet and a sailor and a sculptor. And he didn't feel like he was on the margins of culture, because he knew that he was at the convergence point of paths, sea paths that had been used for millennia. He knew his place and his sea, which he studied with a rabbinical intensity and could read surface for depth in a way that I've never seen before with a seagoer. But he was also outwardly connected, and I became fascinated by that idea. And that's sort of what we've been hearing with Ronald, that people come to places that have power, and then they connect and they link outwards. And a place that has many paths converging on it is likely to be a very interesting place, I suspect.
One of the things that I was interested in is how both your books seem, as well as being haunted by these landscapes, seem haunted by certain presences. And I know John Nash was a friend of yours and you lived with him before you inherited the house. But there's John Clare, there's John Constable, and with your book, obviously, there's Thomas and Revilius. What drew you to them? Was there a sense of kinship through the years? What was it about them?
Well, in my case, they were just neighbours. I was drawn to them because they were artists. I wanted to be an artist more than a writer at the time, I think. I liked drawing and things like that. But I knew them all from boyhood onwards. And there was the Colchester Art Society, full of the most marvellous painters at that particular time. And then, of course, when I went to Aldborough and was working with Benjamin Britten, it was music. And all these people seemed to me simply creating people who made things. That's what I felt. So I was driven, I suppose, to be a writer because I wanted to make these things. And I don't understand quite what it means, but there's such a thing as style, which all the writers I love possess.
Yes.
But they don't know they possess it. And style comes from the word stylus, which is the little thing which the Greeks used to make marks on a tablet. And everybody made a different kind of mark because it was a different hand. And that's how style began, really. But I loved the way people wrote, poets and novelists, and certain essayists and things like that, and certain great naturalists, too. We've been blessed in this country with some marvellous naturalists, and they continue. They don't belong. We could sort of trace perhaps Robert back to W.H. Hudson, for instance, or to somebody in the White, Selborne. All the time there have been people, sometimes in country rectories, sometimes people working on farms, sometimes people at sea, like Conrad, who wrote. They simply loved to write, and they knew how to write, but they wrote in their own hand, in their own certain way. And because of this, the writing itself becomes great. It's not just ordinary writing, it's so individualistic. And so, bit by bit, we follow these people, we read them, because they communicate with us because of their ability to write in a certain way. And we love them for it. They also make us see landscape differently, or a townscape, or wherever you happen to be, or another book. Or this famous place here, they see it differently. When I read the voluminous writings about Charleston, which the Nashes possess, which are on my bookshelves now, I got to know this place intimately, although I've never having seen it. And when I came this morning, it all came together in a most amazing way. So when we're doing it, when writing these books in a certain place, and it might be in a street in Cambridge or a funny old house like mine down a track, it's much the same thing. A lot of writers don't leave a room. It might be just a room in a big city or a flat or something like that. Or they might write a lot out of doors, which I rather like doing. And Claire did. It is this place, we call place, wherever it happens to be, has an immense influence on us.
And that's obviously something that you've felt very deeply as well.
The influence of place, or the influence of writers and precedents?
Well, I suppose both, in fact.
Yes. Well, I mean, another etymology that might help is that, well, two. One is that ritan, our word writing comes from a word ritan, which means to kind of incise or furrow a track. And there's this very old relationship between walking and writing in that sense, the feet as the pen nib. Walking has long been a kind of writing and a kind of reading too. And I've been fascinated by people for whom that has been powerfully true, like Nan Shepherd, this wonderful Scottish writer who spent her life again in a very writing about a very small space, arguably. I mean, the Cairngorm Massif, which is vast but circumscribed, or Thomas himself, or Revilius. But there's yes. And
what was it about Thomas? I'm intrigued at what it was that drew you to him.
Well, you've been very powerfully drawn to Woolf, I know, and these relationships become intense, though those who are the subject of them have no say in the matter because they're dead.
Yes.
Well, I will say one thing about Thomas, and it is that I when I first really began reading and thinking about him, it was out of a wish that he'd be a man that he wasn't, and that man, a person that he wasn't, and that person was somebody for whom nature was profoundly consoling and completing, and always provided the solace that he needed. And it took a long time for me to realise that he wasn't that person at all, that sometimes he went to nature for return and completion and the things that go under that slightly awkward word of spirituality, though a word I'm personally very happy to use. But actually that other times he went to nature and found it gave him no answer at all. It was indifferent, absolute in its disinterest. And I didn't really want to see that to begin with. So I became interested in his darknesses and his blacknesses and his difficulties with landscape. And we mustn't always sanctify place and what it can do for us.
And I think that's one of the things that really makes Robert's book very powerful, is the last sequence is about Thomas and Thomas's, as Ronnie said as well, Thomas's very tragic end. And that sense that in some ways he was failed by landscape, or not failed by, but expected, hoped for more than it couldn't ultimately console him.
What consoled him was the war. I don't want to preempt Matthew Hollis this evening, but he was never really happier than when he'd left his family and indeed his beloved landscape, though he was still on chalk in northern France. And he had had the burden of expectation and obligation removed from him, because all he had to do was be a soldier, and he was rather good at that, and that left him less worried. He spent his time sitting in hedges and in desperate danger and watching landscape through binoculars, and that was kind of what he really liked doing, but without having to write about it, and that was what he didn't like doing very much in the end.
That actually brings me to another question that I wanted to ask. I noticed there's an awful lot of paths back and forward between these two books. They slip in and out of each other in very interesting ways. It's really worth reading them together. One of the things that struck me is how many of these artists and writers were war artists. That we've got Nash, both the Nash brothers, Eric Revilius and Edward Thomas, all very influenced by war. And as well, Robert's book, at one point he goes to Palestine, and that's another very moving section where he's walking through this contested, violent landscape. And I wondered what you thought about how the experience of war influences how one sees a landscape, makes one feel about a landscape.
Well, the war artists were invented by John Buchan at the beginning of the First World War. And you were made a lieutenant, and Paul Nash was made one at once. John Nash, who wasn't very strong physically, eventually went 2 years later to the Western Front in the Artist Rifles. And they were, the generals in the 19th century hated photographers going to war, particularly the Crimean War. They were shocked. They thought that war had terrible things, but the normal person shouldn't see them. Only soldiers, etc., or nurses, etc. But eventually, artists produced pictures about the First World War, both here and on the continent, which far above lots of things being written about the war, and far above sometimes sort of poetry and things like that. Quite incredible, these scenes. And Paul Nash did a group of lithographs called We're Making a New World of the Western Front with trees. And he was accused in 1970, when they were shown it in a gallery in London, of being unpatriotic. People couldn't understand it. But one of the things you get, rather like with Edward Thomas, was they were profoundly moved by the Western Front, this in vast, massive trenches, because the birds went on singing just normally. And also, eventually, with Isaac Rosenberg, particularly, saw poppies growing. And he invented, not invented really, but thought of this marvellous thing of the poppy, which we wear now, was the poppy on the top of the trench, things like, which went on blooming. And I went to Passchendaele. It's just a little turning when you get through Ypres on the right, with a little board rather like the one down to my house. And you walk along this high ground, and here is this great plain over which men have killed each other for centuries, and including the worst of the Western Front battles. And you imagine most of the people in the First World War were farm workers, either from Germany or Britain, and there they were digging their own graves, in a sense. But the birds went on singing, and the flowers went on blooming, and the platitude. And the kind of disaster of it all moves us to this very day. And similar things happened in the Second World War and at Vietnam. So writers do need to walk where these appalling things happen and to write and say what they see, and painters need to paint what they see, and which they do. It's not convenient sometimes for society, but they will show you things and tell you things which can't be seen in any other way, which is why it's so important that artists and poets should be present.
Well, I've long been interested in absent landscapes, the landscapes that we carry within us and remember, as opposed to those that we are in or live in or are in the moment. And they are very powerful presences. So I've long been interested in exiles, prisoners, refugees, people who have been displaced in some way and for whom their landscapes persist imaginatively but still very informingly. Thomas had an odd experience of that because he, Aris, as I've already said, was on chalk and flint. He was on the same geological deposit that he spent most of his life on the South Downs, which was once continuous but then gouged out and became the English Channel. So he had a curious, uncanny feeling of familiarity when he arrived on his Western Front, because he found himself more or less back where he began, back on his... So he was inevitably thinking frequently about home. My grandfather, who I write about, settled in the Cairngorms reasonably late in his life and gradually lost mobility. He lived a long time, but as happens, he became less and less able to move, so his territory shrank and shrank and shrank. Even at 90, he was still on his skis on the drive, but he wasn't able to be on his skis on the Cairngorm Plateau. And so, in an odd way, he was in his landscape, but it was also absent from him. So he too would go on these map walks. He would finger walk routes on maps of the Cairngorms. His children and grandchildren would come back and tell him stories of the paths they had walked, and he would say, "Oh no, I think it's not a left there. You would have gone right round the corner where the waterfall." I mean, he had an incredible topographic memory, astonishing detail and recall, and that was really the landscape he lived in for the last few years of his life. So I suppose that war has always interested me, partly for that reason.
And that's another very beautiful sequence of Robert's book. He makes a journey to his grandfather's funeral across the Cairngorms, and it really is an astonishing bit of writing and an astonishing thing to do as well, an astonishing kind of pilgrimage. I think at this point we should open the floor up for questions, if anybody would like to ask things. I'll just say a quick word, though. If you wait for the microphone and then you stand up, that would be very much appreciated. I think we've got one here. They are coming towards you. Be patient. Do you mind waiting? They're literally right behind you. Thank you.
Yeah. This is really a question about water, because we've heard a lot about experience of the landscape from the land, standing on the land. Olivia, your book is To the River, and I haven't finished it, but I think it's all experience from the river bank. I wonder what it would have been like on the water, taking a boat down the river. And really, can you say something, all of you, about what it's like to experience landscape on water?
That's a very good question. I was thinking this morning, it literally hadn't occurred to me how influenced I'd been by three men in a boat, and that there was some correlation between the journey that I made and that journey. But I think I'll hand this over to Robert, who does make quite a bit of his journey by way of sea roads.
Well, I suppose the big difference is that land holds marks and water doesn't. It is a self-erasing surface. We leave our footprints and they can last 5,000 years. We sail a boat and our track lasts a minute, depending on the wave conditions. And yet there are these routes that are determined by current and prevailing wind and landfall and so forth. So I became fascinated by that paradox of, as it were, invisible, non-existent and yet durable paths. And there's a chapter in the book where I walk something called the Broomway, which is a tidal path, which is halfway between land and water. And you're walking on a depth of It's off the Essex coast. It's a bit like the Morecambe Bay sands.
It's a very high-risk path, I'd like to add at this point.
Well, as long as
it's quite nerve-wracking to read.
As long as the moon stays in its conventional orbits, then and you've got your tide times right, then you should be fine. It's much less dangerous than Morecambe, which has had its own tragedies. But you are walking neither on water nor on land, and there's an image on the back of the book in which that's me walking on the mirror, as it were, of the water, but at 1 inch depth. It was deeply eerie, deeply uncanny in the sense of doubling, because you're always being followed by your own reflection. And you would look back, and there would be no mark of your passage, and yet you walked onwards. And it was probably the strangest, in terms of eeriest walk I've ever taken. Anyway, water paths have their paradoxes, but rivers are in a way the oldest routes of them all. Glaciers too, in the Himalayas and in Scandinavia, have long been routes through mountain country because they are relatively less disrupted than some of the high pass crossings.
There's another neat little coincidence here, because I seem to remember Bottengoms Farm, isn't there a path where the river or a stream used to run through your house?
It was thought a great convenience. The water came through the house on the floor. And I think in Dove Cottage, it's bricked in, so you didn't have to go outside to get the water.
But you know, it seems very sensible, but I worry about the rheumatism.
Over a brick floor. Nash, I'm glad to say, put it around the back, so it goes around the side of the house. But what is very interesting, particularly what Robert was saying, is that, first of all, rivers were never owned by anybody. You couldn't own a river. A lot of the river names are Celtic. They go back an enormous distance, and they form the boundaries of many counties and estates, etc. They also, you've only got to row a boat up quite a small river in the countryside you've seen all your life, and you're seeing a landscape, it's only a few yards away, totally different to what you've seen when you're walking on the footpath. It's quite incredible, really. You should try it. It's devastating. Just suddenly you're in a foreign place because you're on this water path going up, which we sometimes row from Nayland up to Whiston Mill, somewhere out 3 miles. But it's another world because you're on the water. But the river's been terribly neglected in many ways. There are lots of old Victorian photographs of our village where one of Constable's barges were used for the Sunday school outing. Perhaps 100 boys and girls and their mums were all on this in big hats, about 1890, going about 2 miles. It was the day out for the year, just slowly going along. And yet, although they could almost see their own houses and see the church and things like that, because they're on the water, they were abroad in some strange way. It's very interesting.
Abroad's the word.
Wonderful.
Yes, that's right. The other thing is, just briefly, that many great works of literature were composed on the hoof. The Wordsworth and Coleridge did it. They sort of walked and made up their... And John Clare did it. They wrote and walked. And when John Clare was ploughing, he couldn't write it down, but he did what he called his muttering. He hated gardening because he looked like an insane man, gardening and muttering. But on a great field with a plough, nobody could tell really. And he would say his lines over and over again, so he would remember them to write them down when he got home in the evening in his little bedroom. So walking is it's a very imaginative thing to do, as well as a very healthy thing to do, almost the best thing to do. Lots of people take pills, I think, but they should go for long walks.
A prescription we can all approve of. Do we have any more questions?
In 1985, I undertook and achieved a 2,000-mile walk. And people often say, what impressed you most? And they don't perhaps get the answer they're looking for. But I say, well, the geology. I'm not a geologist, but I was well aware as I walked that it was geology that was influencing everything that I was seeing. And I walked Offa's Dyke, so a very historic, age-old boundary path, pirate paths, coffin ways, salt ways, all of which no longer have their original use. I crossed canals on bridges so that the path had been bisected by the navvies who built the canals. I crossed railways, either the railway itself or by bridge, and I became very aware that paths are changing all the time and ever have been, that the original uses have long past perhaps, but now give us what we would unhappily call leisure use. Now we face HS2, which is my home county of Bucks, much affected, and I feel grieved over the loss of paths, but I'm trying to get it in perspective by saying that many of the paths I walked were now outmoded in their use, and perhaps this is just one more shake-up for the grid of paths. Did this feeling come to you at all, either of you, in your walking times and in your writing? Were you aware of it?
Well, I salute your 2,000-mile walk. As somebody who's never walked anything like that continuously, that's a huge distance. Yes, I mean, in an odd way, I relish those juxtapositions because, I mean, one of the first paths I walked was the Akenfield Way, which was thought to be 5,000 years old, but probably recent archaeological work suggests is probably post-Roman, in fact. It is bisected by the M11, almost at a perfect perpendicular. And that was one of the first of many such clashes or binds, depending on how you look at them. But your point about geology I find particularly fascinating. A student of mine walked the Santiago de Compostela route and wrote to me how wonderful to feel a whole country roll under my feet and feel the changes of substance and surface. And that idea that geology informs us, that we walk on what I somewhere in the book call mind-altering surfaces, that we are changed by what we feel under our feet in ways that are very, very hard to see and talk about. But nonetheless, these are textures and slopes and felt experiences of place. There's a lovely line in Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman. He says, "The continual cracking of my feet on the road had made a bit of the road come up into me." And I recognise that.
Probably quite a lot of the road by the time you'd finished.
Yes.
Do we have more? Do we have any more questions? Yes.
Yes, just a question for Ronald. I've loved the pieces that you've written at the Church Times over so many years from Worthingfold, which is a weekly column. I write for the Church Times as well, but only about every 6 or 8 weeks. I can't imagine how you manage to produce such haunting and lyrical pieces week after week after week. Where do you get your discipline from and your material for them?
It should be stopped. It's been going on about 20 years. But I'm allowed to do anything, really. So sometimes a piece of imagination or some toil I'm doing, or somebody's come to stay, or taking matins, music, the past. I don't know. It's a little diary, really. Every 3 or 4 years made into a little book, but it just goes on all the time. I do it straight onto the typewriter. I don't write. I write all my books by hand normally, but I just do these on Tuesday mornings. And I actually don't see the Church Times, not because it's not a very good paper, because I thought it might influence me. So I don't know what goes on there, really.
We've uncovered a scandal. Do we have any more? Another one here.
Thank you. Good morning, and thanks very much for those lovely inputs or descriptions or talks, whatever to call them. One of the many things that's been stimulated for me by what you've said this morning is about gender and walking. And I was very struck with both Ronald and Robert that really the artists and the writers that you seem to have been inspired by most were mostly men, although there was that lovely Neolithic family. And I was thinking there was almost a throwaway comment about the artists rambling off and the women, the boys going off and the women staying behind, presumably to make their stews or look after the children or tend the kitchen garden or go to the well. And it got me thinking about whether women's experiences of walking have been very circumscribed, although there have been some exceptions like Tess of the D'Urbervilles or Dorothy Wordsworth. now it's possible for a woman to walk 2,000 miles. So I'm thinking about whether there are different spirits that haunt maybe the path to the well or the path around the vegetable garden. That perhaps would be whether there's a gender issue or difference. And then, struck by Olivia's book I've just started and loving it so far, about having the woman, Virginia Woolf, as one of your companions. And I just wondered if you wanted to reflect on that, whether it is an interesting point, really.
Well, I'm very sorry that I didn't. Christine Nash, who's Christine Kuhlenthal.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
I think in Ronald's book, and maybe we've given it a slightly unfair idea, I was really struck by how both of them, John and Christine, come across as artists in their own right. I thought that was very nicely handled.
I mean, John Nash never walked anywhere if he could help it. But Christine and I, who was a tall, elegant woman, we walked vast distances, really. I mean, I should have mentioned her. She was a wonderful companion for walking. She'd come out for a walk at a drop of a hat. She'd come out for a walk. She said, and we'd just leave the house open, just go for a long, long walk, really. But not John. He would perhaps drive to where we were later on. but yes, but as a matter of fact, I have met many women who are wonderful walkers. One thing I just wanted to end with, really, was about during the Commonwealth, all the old holidays were abolished by the state, by Cromwell. And the other thing was all pilgrimages and things like that were abolished. This is in the 1650s. And so Bunyan, in Pilgrim's Progress, which is a walk book, he said that men and women and children should use the pilgrimage route as the way to work, to the farm or to the big house or to the fields or whatever, in a hardy-like way. And this should be a contemplation, and this is where their imagination should exist, and where they should look for plants and things like that. It's the most marvellous idea. But nobody took, at time, any thought to what people... It was beginning, really, of Gradgrind, in a sense, that they hadn't any time off, except for Sundays, when they had to go to church all the time. But bit by bit, I think, particularly in the 30s, during the Great Depression, men and women walked miles all over England and cycled miles, and it was a huge, great thing, this walking everywhere, including the great marches.
Well, I'd like to hear what Olivia has to say about this, but it's a crucial point, and a very, very important one. Rebecca Solnit, in her great history of walking wanderlust, reflects on precisely the kinds of stigma and control, why women couldn't walk streets at night because they become street walkers. There are kinds of oppression that are unspoken. Nan Shepherd it provides the epigraph to the book and is a very strong presence in the book. I've become fascinated by her own practices on Deeside and in the Cairngorm Massif. But you are right that predominantly it's men who have, as it were, been able to make these walks. But as Ronald says, there is a whole repertoire of private kinds of experience that don't necessarily go recorded as formally or as publicly as published work, for men and for women, uncounted kinds of miles of thought, as it were, whether those are repeated small journeys around the garden or to and from the well, or the longer, more sort of ritual walks. It's just the material is harder to get at, and that's something Olivia has done in her book.
And I think also it is harder to get at. I think also it's written, and maybe it's small presses, or there's an astonishing tradition of North American late 19th century and early 20th century women landscape writers, women naturalists, and some of these are collected and you can get hold of the collections, but they're difficult to get hold of. So I think women do certainly walk and do write about their walking, but it tends to be a sort of a silenced voice, and a voice that you have to listen hard for. Virginia Woolf was obviously not a voice you have to listen hard for at all, because she's very clearly there. She's very much in the canon. And the way she writes about city writing, the way she writes about rural writing is, to my mind, as fine as anyone else that we have. And the way that she writes as well about how writing and walking interconnect, I think that's something that she's extremely good at. But I feel like it's something that I'm always encouraged when younger women writers say that they want to do these kind of walking books, because I think it is something that voices need to be added to the dialogue, I suppose. Do we have any more? We're getting short on time, but I think we can fit one more in. Any more questions? Any from this side, which has been quiet? Yes, one here.
Okay. Hello, thank you. I wondered if you could talk about your relationship with solitude and creativity, because here we are in this packed-out tent, and there's glimpses of it and things that you've both said, all three of you actually. Here we are in the tent. I picture you though alone, wrestling with experience and bringing that experience back to us. And I hoped you might be able to say something about that.
Who wants to start there? We probably are all quite solitary people in ways.
Yes, I don't know how to sort of describe solitude, since I live alone, but with lots of friends coming and going, and neighbours sometimes walking past with a dog or something, or a horse. But I have no sense of loneliness or aloneness, really. It seems quite so normal, really. But at the same time, you see, I sometimes might walk in Colchester or in London, and I love sometimes Liverpool Street Station, and you stand there for a little while, and it's quiet because of this new kind of paving, and there's milling human beings. It's profoundly moving. They've all got lives of their own, and you're overwhelmed by it, really. But I don't know quite how to describe it. I certainly am unused to living in a crowded house with lots of people rushing about and doing things. I remember a long time ago, we had a friend who lived in a great country house in Suffolk, and with all the servants, sort of thing you watch on television these days, and he said it was awful because there's no solitude, and you were watched and seen. You couldn't walk in the garden without being watched by many people, and if you in your bedroom, everything you possessed was looked at. And it's wonderful now to be in the house, which is the same house, very cold I might say, where, you know, lots of you just walk along and all the things are still there, and it somehow works, but there's nobody doing anything really except in the kitchen, which is a good thing. But solitude is very extraordinary. People desire it. It's a lovely word to be solitary. And I've never analysed it, really.
I'll just answer briefly and say I wanted to write this time, having spent a lot of time walking on my own, I wanted to write a very convivial book. I wanted to write it's a book about keeping company, whether with people living or people dead. And many of the walks are taken with people, and I found that so enlivening and enriching. I think perhaps I've begun to outgrow my own desire to look like the wanderer above a sea of clouds and stand in my black frock coat looking out over the Harz Mountains. And I've just, even the walks I take on my own, Thomas is there in some sense, or Shepherd, or but with my friend the Marxist tax lawyer, or my friend the sailor and storyteller. So because paths are about people, as I said at the beginning, they relate. So, but thank you for the question.
I'll actually answer this one too, because the book that I'm about to start working on next is about loneliness and creativity and the relationship between them. And I think, well, loneliness and solitude are very different words, aren't they? They have very different qualities. But I became very interested in the ways in which solitude feeds into creativity. And people like, particularly visual artists, people like Warhol, suffer from incredible loneliness despite having very convivial lives. And I was interested in how that sort of space might have a relationship with creativity. But as to conclusions, you'll maybe have to wait a few years. I think we're out of time now.
I think out of time sounds like a very sort of poetic ending to what has been an absolutely beautiful and lyrical session, highlighting so many connections between each other's work, all three of you, connections with so many people connected with Charleston, whether it's Virginia Woolf or Revilius or John Nash or Paul Nash, Carrington, connections with Charleston itself. Thank you very much for a fantastic event. Well, can we thank all of them?